Some speak of an unholy visitor in the night, an experience not exactly a dream, but something intentional, almost purposeful. A weight, a presence, a figure at the edge of waking that could not quite be seen, could not quite be escaped, and could not quite be explained. Across thousands of years and dozens of cultures, that visitor was given many names. In the Western tradition, the name that stuck was Incubus. Today, we trace that name and everything behind it, from its earliest roots in ancient Mesopotamia, through the theological debates of the medieval church, through legend, trial records, and the rare voices that dared to push back. This is its full story. If you find this kind of deep mythological content valuable, please do take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel. It truly helps us keep making these episodes. Now, let us begin. The word incubus was derived from the Latin verb incubare, which meant to lie upon, or to press down upon. The name was not metaphorical. It described a physical experience, the crushing, suffocating pressure that people reported feeling on their chests upon waking in the night, accompanied by the absolute inability to move or call for help. The incubus was defined, across virtually every tradition that named it, as specifically male in nature and specifically predatory toward women. This is the critical distinction that separates it from its female counterpart, the succubus, which was said to target men. The two were related figures in the broader tradition of demonic sexuality, but they were not interchangeable. This episode concerns itself with the incubus, the male demon, and the women it was said to pursue. The concept of the incubus traces back to the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, particularly the Sumerians and Babylonians, who recorded accounts of demonic entities thousands of years before the Latin term itself came into use. In Sumerian and Babylonian demonology, there was a class of male demons known as the Lilu. The Lilu were night-roaming spirits, specifically male in nature, who were said to descend upon sleeping women and force themselves upon them. They appeared in cuneiform tablets alongside lists of other dangerous supernatural beings, and they were considered genuinely threatening, not allegorical, not symbolic, but a real hazard against which protective incantations were necessary. Tablets excavated from ancient Mesopotamian sites contain ritual formulas specifically addressed to repelling the Lilu from the bodies of sleeping women. The Lilu was not a minor or peripheral figure in Mesopotamian demonology. It sat within a well-developed taxonomy of supernatural threats, and it occupied precisely the same conceptual space that the incubus would later occupy in the Western tradition. Scholars of ancient Near Eastern religion, including the work compiled in Walter Farber's Contributions to Ancient Magic and Divination, published 1999, have identified the Lilu as one of the earliest documentable ancestors of the incubus figure in the Western tradition. Greeks and Romans inherited and transformed many elements of Near Eastern mythology, and the tradition of the nocturnal male demon was among them. In Greek tradition, a spirit called the Ephialtes, whose name translated roughly as the one who leaps upon, was said to descend upon sleeping people, causing the sensations of weight, breathlessness, and paralysis. The name itself acknowledged the physical, pressing character of the experience. The Ephialtes was understood to be an external entity, something that entered the sleeper's world from outside, not a product of the sleeper's own imagination. Galen, the 2nd century Greek physician whose writings formed the backbone of European medicine for more than 1,000 years, addressed the incubus condition in medical language. He described the symptoms: the pressure on the chest, the inability to breathe freely, the paralysis of the limbs, and attributed them to a disorder of the body. But Galen was working within a world where the boundary between medical and supernatural explanation was porous, and his clinical description did nothing to diminish the popular belief in an actual visiting demon. The Romans developed the tradition further through their belief in the Faunus or Fauns, the goat-legged woodland spirits associated with the god Faunus. The Fauns were said to be lustful and unrestrained, prone to pursuing women through the night and assaulting them. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his Naturalis Historia, the great encyclopaedic work of the 1st century CE, noted popular beliefs in nocturnal spirits and their alleged sexual aggression. The fauns were not quite the same as the later medieval incubus, but they occupied the same mythological role, the uninvited male spirit who violated the safety of a woman's sleep. It was this Roman tradition, particularly the association between the fauns and nocturnal assault, that the early Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo encountered and chose to address directly. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, was one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Christianity. His De Civitate Dei, which translates to the City of God, was a monumental work of theology written in response to the sack of Rome in 410 CE, and within it, Augustine turned his attention to the question of incubi. In Book 13, chapter 23, Augustine wrote the following: "There is too a very general rumor, which many have verified by their own experience, or which trustworthy persons who have heard the experience of others corroborate, that Sylvans and fauns, who are commonly called incubi, had often made wicked assaults upon women and satisfied their lust upon them." This passage was enormously consequential. Augustine did not declare incubi to be mere superstition. He acknowledged the widespread testimony of women and of those who had heard their accounts as credible enough to take seriously. In doing so, he gave the incubus theological weight that no amount of skeptical argument could easily dissolve. If one of the greatest minds in all of early Christianity had treated these accounts as credible, the incubus could not be dismissed. Augustine framed the incubus as a species of the Roman fauns and sylvans, spirits that the Christian tradition was now absorbing and reclassifying as demonic beings, fallen entities whose activities were real, but whose power was subject to God's governance. This was the theological foundation upon which centuries of subsequent debate would be built. In the early 7th century, the Spanish bishop and scholar Isidore of Seville undertook the ambitious project of compiling all human knowledge into a single encyclopaedic work. The result was the Etymology, one of the most widely read and copied books of the entire medieval period. In Book 8 of the Etymology, Isidore defined the incubus by name. He described it as a demon of male form, known in the common language as incubi, which was said to lie upon women in the night and engage in carnal congress with them against their will. Isidore connected the incubus explicitly to the Roman fauns, following the line of argument that Augustine had established, and he placed the incubus within a broader taxonomy of demonic beings. What made Isidore's treatment significant was its format. The Etymology was not a theological treatise debated in monasteries. It was a reference work, consulted by scholars, clergy, and educated laypeople across Europe for centuries. By including the incubus as a defined entry, Isidore normalized it as a known and documented category of being. The incubus was, in effect, in the encyclopedia. It was real enough to be named and described alongside other established facts of the natural and supernatural world. As medieval theology grew more sophisticated, the precise metaphysical nature of the incubus became a matter of serious and sometimes contentious scholarly debate. The central problem was this: if the incubus was a demon, and demons were understood to be fallen angels, beings of pure spirit, how could it have a physical effect on a woman's body? How could something without flesh impose weight, cause bruising, or produce the physical sensations that so many women reported? Thomas Aquinas, the most authoritative theologian of the High Middle Ages, addressed this question in his Summa Theologica. Aquinas argued that fallen angels could assume what he called aerial bodies, not truly flesh, but a form of condensed matter that could interact with the physical world. This aerial body was temporary, assumed for the purpose of a particular act, and then dissolved. It was not the demon's true nature, but it was real enough in its physical effects. This concept of the aerial body became the standard theological explanation for how the incubus could do what it was said to do. It could press down upon a woman because it had assumed a body capable of pressing. It could cause pain and bruising because its assumed form was capable of exerting physical force. It was not a hallucination. It was not a dream. It was a real entity imposing itself on a real woman, albeit through a mechanism that was supernatural in origin. Aquinas was precise and careful in his language. He did not revel in these descriptions. But his willingness to engage with the mechanism in detail gave the belief a philosophical infrastructure that was extremely difficult to dismantle. Were incubi fallen angels? This question sat at the very heart of the incubus's theological identity, and it did not have a single clean answer. Different traditions, different texts, and different centuries produced competing responses. The mainstream position of medieval Christian theology was clear. Yes, demons were fallen angels. The incubus as a demon was therefore a fallen angel. This was the position assumed, even when not always explicitly stated, by Augustine, by Isidore, and by Aquinas. When Aquinas described the incubus assuming an aerial body, he was describing a fallen angel doing so. In the Book of Enoch, a particular group of angels fell for an entirely different reason: desire. These angels were called the Watchers, and they had been assigned to watch over humanity, to observe and guide from above. But they looked down upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful, and 200 of them made a deliberate and collective decision. They descended to Mount Hermon, took human women as wives. The children born of the Watchers' unions with human women were the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and appetite, who consumed everything available to them and then turned on humanity itself. God's response to the Watchers was absolute punishment. The archangel Michael bound the Watchers on the earth, beneath the mountains, to await the final judgment. And the Nephilim, the giant offspring, were destroyed in the great flood that followed, though their spirits did not simply cease to exist. According to 1 Enoch chapter 15, when the Nephilim were killed, their disembodied spirits became the demons that continued to afflict humanity as evil spirits without bodies, condemned to wander the earth, to inhabit it, and to cause harm within it. In this understanding, these orphan spirits of the giant children of angels became the incubi. One of the most revealing bodies of evidence for the medieval understanding of the incubus comes not from demonological texts, but from hagiography, the written lives of the saints. Accounts of holy women being attacked or tempted by incubi appeared repeatedly in the hagiographic literature of the medieval church, and their very inclusion in these sacred texts said something significant. The incubus was not considered the exclusive affliction of sinful or spiritually negligent women. It attacked the devout as well. The attack itself was not the sin. Compliance was. This distinction would later be almost entirely lost in the witchcraft trial era, when incubus visitation was treated as inherently evidence of willing demonic alliance. In these accounts, the incubus typically appeared to holy women during the night, often in the form of a man, sometimes a handsome stranger, sometimes a figure already known to the woman, and sometimes an angel whose true nature was gradually revealed to be demonic. The purpose of the visitation, in hagiographic terms, was understood as a test of virtue. The woman who successfully repelled the incubus, through prayer, through calling on the name of Christ, or the Virgin Mary, or through other acts of devotion, was shown to be genuinely holy. The incubus was not merely a theological abstraction. It had consequences in the practical governance of the medieval church, and it appeared in canon law, the formal legal code by which the church administered its authority. Canon law addressed the question of what happened when a woman claimed to have been impregnated by an incubus. Women who became pregnant under circumstances they could not or would not explain sometimes attributed their condition to incubus visitation, and the church needed a framework for responding to such claims. The canonical position, broadly accepted through the high medieval period, was that a child conceived as a result of an incubus encounter was nevertheless a fully human child with a human soul, and was entitled to baptism and the full rights of a Christian person. The sin, if any, was attached to the circumstances of the conception, not to the child. This position was consistent with the broader Christian doctrine that the soul was infused directly by God at the moment of conception and was in no way determined by the manner of that conception. Canon law also addressed the question of whether a woman who was assaulted by an incubus while unconscious or asleep bore any moral responsibility for the act. The general position was that she did not, provided there was no prior invitation or willing engagement with demonic forces. This placed the involuntary incubus encounter in the same general moral category as other forms of non-consensual violation, a harm done to a woman, not a sin committed by her. Across the accumulated tradition, from early Roman accounts through the full flowering of medieval demonology, a remarkably consistent picture of the incubus's capabilities took shape. The incubus was believed to be capable of rendering itself entirely invisible. Its presence might be felt as a weight, heard as a breath, or sensed as a cold current in the air, but it could move through a room without being seen. This invisibility made it particularly terrifying. There was no way to look for it, no way to confirm its absence. When the incubus chose to make itself visible, it was said to be capable of taking on any male form it wished. Most commonly, it appeared as a human man, a stranger of striking appearance, or sometimes as a man already known to the victim, a husband away at war, a local figure of authority, or even a priest. This capacity for disguise had profound social consequences. If an incubus could appear as any man, then the testimony of a woman who claimed to have been visited by a known man in the night could not be straightforwardly trusted. The visitor might have been the man himself, or it might have been a demon wearing his face. The incubus was said to be capable of passing through walls, locked doors, and any physical barrier. No degree of physical security could prevent its entrance. Bolted shutters, locked rooms, even the presence of other people in the same chamber did not deter it. It was believed to cause specific and identifiable physical symptoms in its victims: exhaustion that did not respond to sleep or rest, pallor, loss of appetite and weight, and bruising or marks on the body that appeared without any natural explanation. Women who exhibited these symptoms in combination were frequently suspected of incubus visitation by both medical practitioners and members of the clergy. The incubus was also said to be capable of inducing vivid and seductive dreams, constructing within the mind of the sleeping woman an entire imagined landscape designed to lower her resistance and draw her into willing engagement before she had fully realized what was happening. It possessed physical strength far beyond any human capacity, and was described in many accounts as capable of restraining a fully awake and actively resisting woman without difficulty. And critically, the incubus was believed to be capable of impregnating a woman. This claim was the most theologically fraught of all its attributed powers, and it generated the longest and most complex debate in the demonological literature, a debate that ultimately shaped one of the most famous legends in all of Western mythology. Among all the legends associated with the incubus in Western tradition, none was more enduring, more widely told, or more culturally consequential than the account of the birth of Merlin, the great prophet and counselor of Arthurian legend. The account was first recorded in sustained detail by the Welsh cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth in his Historia Regum Britannia, completed around 1136 CE. In Book 6 of that work, Geoffrey recounted the circumstances of Merlin's birth through the direct testimony of Merlin's own mother, given before the court of King Vortigern. Merlin's mother was described as a daughter of the king of Demetia, a devout woman who had devoted herself to a life of religious observance within a convent. She testified that a being had visited her, a being that appeared to her in the form of a handsome man, that spoke with her, that seemed at times entirely present and at other times could not be seen at all, even when his presence was still felt. Through this visitation, she conceived a child. That child was Merlin. Geoffrey of Monmouth described the visitant as belonging to a class of spirits that existed in the space between the moon and the earth, neither fully demonic nor fully angelic in his framing, though he left the identification deliberately ambiguous. Later writers in the Arthurian tradition were less reserved. The authors of the 13th century Vulgate cycle, the vast French prose reworking of the Arthurian legends, stated explicitly that Merlin's father was a demon, an incubus who had deliberately targeted Merlin's mother for the purpose of siring a child who would serve the forces of darkness. The paradox at the heart of the legend was what made it so compelling and so theologically interesting. The incubus had chosen Merlin's mother precisely because of her virtue. The child of a saintly woman and a demon would, the demons hoped, be a being of enormous power deployed in the service of evil. But the mother had Merlin baptized immediately upon his birth, and baptism in Christian theology cleansed the soul of all prior taint. Merlin's infernal parentage gave him his extraordinary gifts: prophecy, command over natural forces, the ability to see the hidden workings of the world. But his baptism aligned those gifts with the purposes of God and of the legitimate British kingship, rather than with the darkness from which they had come. Beyond the formal theological and literary tradition, the incubus was a living presence in the folk belief of medieval and early modern Europe, nowhere more vividly than in the Alpine regions of what are now Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. In the German-speaking world, a figure closely related to the incubus was known as the Alp, sometimes also spelled Alf or Alb. The Alp was a male demonic being believed to ride upon sleeping women, causing the characteristic crushing sensation in the chest and the inability to move or speak. The word gave its name to the German term for nightmare, Albtraum, meaning Alp dream, a linguistic trace of how thoroughly the figure had saturated popular belief. The Alp was distinguished from the more abstract theological incubus by its very specific and detailed folk characterization. It was said to wear a small gray hat, which was the source of its power of invisibility. If a person could seize the Alp's hat while the creature was occupied, the Alp would be rendered helpless and could be compelled to reveal its true identity. In some accounts, the Alp was not an abstract demon, but a specific local man, a neighbor, a relative, or a known figure in the community, who transformed into the Alp at night, unaware of his own nocturnal activities during his waking hours. This belief had significant social consequences. Women who reported Alp visitation sometimes named a specific man as the culprit, and this accusation could have serious repercussions for the named individual, who might find himself the subject of community suspicion or formal complaint, regardless of whether he had any awareness of the supposed nocturnal transformation. In Bavaria and the Tyrol, local accounts described how the Alp entered the bedchamber through the keyhole or a gap in the window frame, moving in a mist or smoke-like form before taking its crushing shape upon the sleeper. The protective measures employed by Alpine communities against the Alp were highly specific. Iron scissors laid open on the chest before sleep, a shoe placed by the bed with the toe pointing toward the door, a handful of linen seeds scattered on the threshold. Because the Alp, obsessively compelled to count any scattered objects it encountered, would be occupied until dawn and unable to reach its victim. The Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain and Portugal, developed its own regional variants of the incubus tradition, some of which shared features with the mainstream theological account, and some of which diverged in revealing ways. In Catalonia and parts of the Pyrenees, a figure known as the Pesante was described, a heavy, dog-like or bear-like creature that seated itself on the chests of sleeping people, producing the characteristic suffocation and paralysis. The Pesante was sometimes described as male, sometimes as ambiguous in sex, and its appearance was more bestial than the humanoid incubus of mainstream theology. Nevertheless, it occupied the same nocturnal, oppressive role, and the protective measures employed against it, placing a sieve or a colander by the bed so that the Pesante would be compelled to pass through every hole before approaching the sleeper, which would take until dawn, had direct parallels in the German Alp tradition. In Portuguese and Brazilian folklore, the Encantado, the Enchanted One, was a river dolphin that could take human male form and visit women in the night. While the Encantado's origins in Brazilian tradition blended indigenous Amazonian and Portuguese colonial beliefs, its European root was traceable to the Iberian incubus tradition brought to the Americas during the colonial period. The Encantado was believed to be irresistibly attractive in its human form, to seduce women deliberately, and to be capable of fathering children. In the 15th century, the incubus underwent a profound transformation in the way it was understood and prosecuted. What had been, in the pastoral theology of the earlier medieval period, a danger done primarily to women, became, in the witchcraft belief system of the late medieval and early modern period, evidence of women's active collaboration with evil. The shift was systematized most powerfully in the Malleus Maleficarum, written by the Dominican Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer and published in 1486. Kramer devoted sustained attention to the question of incubi and succubi, concluding with absolute certainty that such beings existed and operated in the physical world. He argued that the devil assigned incubi specifically to women who had entered into a demonic pact, a voluntary agreement with Satan, and that the incubus's visitation was therefore not an assault inflicted on a victim, but a relationship freely entered into by a witch. This reframing was catastrophic in its consequences. Under Kramer's model, a woman who confessed to incubus visitation was not a victim requiring pastoral care. She was a witch who had invited the devil into her bed, and she was subject to the full rigor of inquisitorial prosecution, and in most cases, death. The Malleus Maleficarum went through more than a dozen print editions in the decades following its publication, and it was used as a reference by inquisitors and secular witch trial judges across Germany, France, the Low Countries, and beyond. The incubus, as framed in its pages, became a standard feature of witch confessions that were extracted under torture and that followed the template the Malleus had established. Women confessed to meeting a demon in male form, to entering into sexual relations with it, and to receiving powers of maleficium, harmful magic, in exchange. The confessions were remarkably consistent across hundreds of trials, in part because the Malleus provided inquisitors with the questions, and the questions shaped the answers. The incubus in this context was described with physical specificity that earlier theological accounts had avoided. Confessing women described the demon's body as cold, unnaturally, penetratingly cold, in contrast to human warmth. Its touch was said to be like ice. This detail appeared in trial records from Germany, France, Scotland, and England, with a consistency that suggested either a genuine shared experience, perhaps the dissociative cold that can accompany extreme fear and pain, or a detail that inquisitors had learned to prompt for and that prisoners had learned to provide. Several specific trial accounts provide concrete illustration of how the incubus appeared in the legal record of the witchcraft era. In the celebrated case of the Basque witch trials of 1609 and 1610, documented in detail by the Spanish Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias in his subsequent report to the Spanish Inquisition, dozens of accused women described encounters with a male demon who visited them in the night. Salazar Frias's report, a remarkable document of early skepticism within the inquisitorial system, systematically examined the physical evidence for these claims and found it wanting. He noted that the marks and signs on the bodies of the accused that were attributed to incubus contact could not be reliably distinguished from natural bruising, skin conditions, or the effects of the accuser's own suggestions. Salazar Frias concluded that the mass of confessions was the product of suggestion, fear, and social contagion rather than genuine demonic activity, and he recommended that prosecutions be suspended, a recommendation that the Spanish Inquisition partially accepted. In Scotland, during the North Berwick witch trials of 1590 to 1591, testimonies included descriptions of encounters with a male demon figure at the gathering known as the Witches' Sabbath. These accounts were taken with deadly seriousness by King James VI of Scotland, who was personally involved in interrogating some of the accused, and they fed directly into James's own subsequent work of demonology, the Demonology, published in 1597. In Book 2 of the Demonology, James addressed the incubus directly, affirming his belief in its existence and its specific activity against women. Despite the formidable catalog of its powers, the incubus was understood across virtually all traditions to have specific vulnerabilities and to be repellable by specific means. Prayer was the first and most universally recommended defense. Sincere prayer before sleep, particularly the recitation of Psalm 91, with its explicit promise of God's protection against the terror of the night, was said to create a spiritual barrier that the incubus could not penetrate without the sleeper's own spiritual weakness having provided it an opening. Holy water held particular power. Sprinkling it around the bed, across the threshold of the room, and on the body before sleep was a common protective practice recommended by priests in their pastoral guidance to women who reported disturbances. The sign of the cross, made deliberately at the moment of sensing the incubus's approach, was described in many accounts as causing the creature immediate retreat. The invocation of the name of Jesus Christ, or the Virgin Mary, was similarly said to be intolerable to the incubus, and women in trial and hagiographic accounts frequently described their successful repulsion of the demon through exactly this means. Salt, universally understood as a purifying substance in both Jewish and Christian tradition, was used in protective rituals. It was scattered around the bed, placed beneath the pillow, or used to draw a protective circle around the sleeping space. Iron, which in folk traditions across Europe was considered to be anathema to supernatural beings of many kinds, was placed near the bed, iron nails, iron blades, or iron horseshoes, as a physical deterrent. The ringing of church bells was said to be physically painful to incubi and to drive them from the area. This belief was pervasive enough that in some communities bells were deliberately rung through the night when a household was believed to be under attack. Exorcism was the ultimate remedy, a formal rite of the church, conducted by an ordained minister, directed specifically at driving a demonic presence from a person or a place. Exorcism was combined, in the pastoral tradition, with the requirement that the afflicted woman make a full confession of any sins that might have provided the incubus with a spiritual foothold, perform the assigned penance, receive absolution, and remain vigilant in her devotional practice thereafter. Francesco Maria Guazzo, in his Compendium Maleficarum of 1608, detailed the process of seeking ecclesiastical relief from incubus torment, emphasizing that the demon's power over an individual woman was directly related to her distance from the sacraments and from active faith. A woman who prayed regularly, confessed regularly, and lived a devout life was understood to be substantially protected against incubus attack. The Compendium Maleficarum also noted that certain physical objects, blessed by a priest, sacred metals, Agnus Dei wax tablets, relics of the saints, could serve as ongoing protective talismans when kept near the bed or worn on the body during sleep. Not every scholar of the early modern period accepted the incubus as a literal and physical reality, and their dissent is an important part of the full historical account. Johannes Weyer, a German physician and one of the earliest significant critics of the witch trial movement, addressed the incubus directly in his De Prestigiis Daemonum, published in 1563. Weyer did not deny the existence of the devil or of demonic beings. To do so would have been theologically dangerous, but he argued that the specific phenomena attributed to incubus visitation, the physical sensations, the apparent marks on the body, the women's own accounts of these encounters, were far more plausibly explained by medical conditions than by genuine demonic activity. Weyer pointed to melancholia, a condition understood in his era as an imbalance of the humors, but which corresponded roughly to what we might now recognize as severe depression or anxiety, as a primary cause of the visions and experiences that women attributed to incubus attack. He argued that physicians, not inquisitors, were the appropriate respondents to these reports, and that prosecuting afflicted women as witches was both medically ignorant and morally unjust. His work was condemned by church authorities and attacked by defenders of the witch trial tradition, including by specific name in later editions of the Malleus Maleficarum apparatus. But his arguments introduced a medical vocabulary for the incubus experience that would gradually displace the theological one over the following centuries. Reginald Scott, an English scholar and country gentleman, went considerably further in his The Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584. In Book 4th, Scott examined the accounts of Incubus visitation with pointed skepticism, arguing that they reflected the frightened and disordered imaginations of women who had been subjected to the power of suggestion, whether by their own fears, by the expectations of their communities, or by the pressures of inquisitorial interrogation. Scott's book was sufficiently threatening to orthodox belief that King James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England, ordered copies burned. But it survived, and was later recognized as one of the most important early works of skeptical inquiry into supernatural belief in the English language. Among the strangest and most philosophically ambitious treatments of the incubus in the entire Western tradition came from the pen of a 17th century Italian Franciscan friar named Ludovico Maria Sinistrari. His treatise De Demonialitate et Incubis et Succubis was written in the 1680s, though it was not published until 1879. Sinistrari proposed something that no major theological writer before him had dared to argue publicly: that incubi were not fallen angels, not demons in the theological sense, and not simple hallucinations. He contended that they were a distinct and previously unclassified category of rational being, a species that existed between humanity and the purely spiritual realm, possessed of physical bodies of their own, capable of genuine thought and feeling, and therefore possessed of souls that raised genuine questions about their moral standing before God. Sinistrari argued that an incubus's interaction with a woman was therefore not precisely the same as a demonic attack. It was an interaction between two embodied rational beings of different species, profoundly problematic, certainly forbidden, but theologically distinct from the straightforward demonic assault described in the Malleus tradition. Sinistrari was not a marginal figure. He was a senior member of the Franciscan order and had served as a theological consultant to the Roman Inquisition. His willingness to reach such unconventional conclusions and to frame the incubus as a being with its own nature, its own desires, and its own spiritual fate illustrated how genuinely vexing a figure the incubus had remained in serious Catholic intellectual thought even at the end of the 17th century. The incubus survived across thousands of years and dozens of cultures because it gave a name and a face to a genuine human experience, and because the experience it named was one that human communities urgently needed to explain. Sleep paralysis, the physiological phenomenon at the core of the incubus tradition, is not rare. Modern studies estimate that a significant portion of the population, somewhere between 25 and 40% across various studies, experiences at least one episode in their lifetime, and a smaller proportion experience it with some regularity. In populations without access to scientific explanation, these episodes were experienced as encounters with a real external being, because they felt exactly like that. But the endurance of the incubus was not purely a matter of sleep physiology. It also reflected the social anxieties of the cultures that sustained it. The incubus tradition encoded fears about sexual violation, about the vulnerability of women's bodies, about the consequences of pregnancy outside of sanctioned social arrangements, and about the limits of human ability to protect the domestic space from outside intrusion. In the theological tradition, the incubus gave the church a framework for addressing the experiences and anxieties that women brought to their confessors and physicians. In the witchcraft era, it provided a mechanism for constructing guilt. In the folk tradition, it gave communities a language for the strange and the inexplicable. In every case, it did what mythology does. It made the unbearable legible. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If it was valuable to you, please share it with someone who loves mythology, history, or the stranger and darker corners of human belief. It makes a genuine difference to this channel. We will see you in the next episode where another story from the ancient world is waiting.